Hi, folks. This is Luke Mel, and welcome to another episode of the Triple Point Training Podcast. I'm going to try something new in this episode. It's a conversation with a group of paddlers that had a close call in Mexico. Let me give you a little teaser.
Rod was like, it's pretty low. I haven't seen it this low. It's going to be rocky. And the first couple days of the trip, we were all like, looking forward to that rain because it'll make the river come up a little bit. And then after that, we were like, well, you got to be careful what you wish for.
And so Rod goes next, and I see him peel out from the top, but I don't see him for a while, and I get nervous because of that. And all of a sudden, he is now out of his boat.
I was getting submerged under the water uh, very frequently, and I barely had like 1 second to reemerge and take my breath. I understand that it was quite serious, my swim.
I think our first questions were like, are you guys okay? And then once we got the yes on that, I was like, Jack, was that a class 5 rapid? And he was like, yes. It's like, oh my goodness. One of my biggest takeaways is, yeah, we encountered really high water and that created a risk, but we also created risk for ourselves by not allowing a bit more of a buffer.
The reason I'm interested in collecting stories like this and data about close calls is that it's low-hanging fruit. It's free data about stuff that almost goes wrong and not quite. So almost an injury or worse, but not quite. And my hope is that it can help us identify themes and trends to help direct what we cover in courses or safety outreach. And this is not just a paddle sport initiative. It's coming from manufacturing and climbing. Everybody wants this data. And it's really hard to collect because it requires some vulnerability to volunteer. Like, we did this thing that maybe we could have done better, or we did this thing that was scary. Anyway, it's a project I'm working on. I am optimistic that if we can crack this nut, it'll really help us prevent future incidents. So let me introduce the folks in the conversation. I first heard about this from Sarah Kilborn. She reached out after the trip and said, hey, we had some scary stuff happen in Mexico. Could we chat about it? And I said, heck yeah, and can we record it to try to glean some lessons learned to then share with the broader paddling community. I know Sarah from her work as the executive director of the American Packrafting Association, APA, and also with Swiftwater Safety Institute, so we overlap quite a bit professionally. Sarah is in Missoula, Montana, and she planned this trip with Jack Henderson from Asheville, North Carolina. Jack is a river manager. He also does some work with APA, and he has maybe a decade of kayak experience. So he's coming from a kayaking background. More recently picked up the packraft as a way to do more remote rivers and international travel. They reached out to Rodrigo Alfonso in Chiapas. He goes by Rod. And Rod was born in Chiapas, but spent some time living in the U.S., and he's back in Chiapas. He has been down this section a bunch of times in the last 14 years, so he's very familiar with the local environment. The team was rounded out by Heidi Blair, a friend of Sarah's from the Missoula paddling community, and Heidi was already in Mexico. They were in touch, and Sarah just said, hey, you should jump on this trip, and she did. So I think that's all I want to say as an introduction. Let's just roll right into it. Let's capture the nature of the river. I was impressed with the list of hazards, and it's like, rockfall, don't camp directly under a canyon wall. The rocks on the shores are really slippery, especially during the portages, like which you have to do. Venomous snakes are present. In-reach messages might not be able to get out. And it's like, wow, okay, so give me the pitch for why we would want to do this. Like, I've got a good sense for all the things that can go wrong. What's the sales pitch? Why did you identify La Venta as the destination?
When Jack and I were first talking about a winter trip, it's like, all right, where's warm? Central America. And I think I was probably the one pushing La Venta a little bit. Just honestly, I think the same reason it's becoming popular is Instagram. What you see on Instagram and from the not detailed trip reports you can find, it's like, oh yeah, this is a very straightforward class 3 pack rafting trip. It's great, it's amazing, it's beautiful. We're not going to post pictures because we don't want to make it more popular. But then all these photos are circulated on Instagram and people are wanting to do it and they're going into it like us, not really knowing fully what you're undertaking.
Yeah, and then having Rod there, I mean, like I'm always, grateful to plan trips off of local knowledge, whether or not someone's physically there or not. So like when Sarah was like, "Oh, like I actually know someone who lives down there who could help us out with planning and maybe join," like, I think a lot of us love planning our own trips as well, but that kind of made it just a little bit more accessible, which I think kind of also is why we prioritized it versus other options.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as far as what went wrong, I love your line, Sarah, in your notes. We encountered a high water situation during an unusually dry year during the dry season. And
Mhm.
I'm
About
just
right.
like, and my notes here is like, I just wrote down,
Yeah.
that sucks. Like, how the hell did you plan for something like
Yeah.
that?
I mean, the,
Yeah,
And you
is that
can't.
yeah, I think, we were talking about it when we all united in San Cristobal. We were like, yeah, this is low water, we were saying, is there going to be enough water? Rod was like, it's pretty low. I haven't seen it this low. It's going to be rocky. And the first couple days of the trip, we were all like, looking forward to that rain because it'll make the river come up a little bit. And then after that, we were like, well, you got to be careful what you wish for.
So you get on the river, and I looked at one of Jack's pictures, and I and I assume this is one of the earlier days. There's one person is sitting on a rock. It looks like, it's not a lot of water moving through the rocks. It looks like very sievy. The rocks have kind of this scalloped texture. Maybe it's limestone or something, just heavily eroded. Somebody is sitting on a different rock, or maybe standing in a pool like waist deep with a throw bag ready, and one paddler is coming down the river, and it's like, it looks awesome. That's early in the trip. And the other things I noticed from that photo, like the walls, even in that section, were quite steep and a mix of like outcrop rock and then just crazy dense jungle. Like from
Mhm.
my eyes, especially coming from a different climate and landscape, is like completely impenetrable.
Yes, it's very remote. The right there, it's a karst. Is that how you pronounce it? It's all limestone, and that's what happens. It's such a sectional river that there can be rain pouring from different directions, filtering in from anywhere, and you don't really have one steady flow. I have experience where it's a steady flow from the beginning to end, and this was extremely dry, and then you get midway through about to the 30-kilometer point, and it's just drenched. Everything's like pouring in. I mean, we had water like squirting in from the walls. Like it was an amazing sight to see. But like in waterfalls that just appear out of nowhere, like that were like 100 feet tall. It was crazy.
When I was looking at that photo that I described, it was like the kind of water, the kind of terrain where I thought, boy, I bet they were glad to have this larger group. And I saw that in your notes as well, Sarah.
I think 4 was a really good number because, I mean, we were setting up safety for each other on some of those rapids, like the bigger ones that we were scouting earlier on, even at lower water. There were spots that you wanted to avoid, and it felt good to have someone at the bottom and someone midway, and just people ready to respond in case anything was needed, and multiple sets of eyes kind of judging and looking at things differently and bringing different perspectives and experiences that felt like they complemented each other. Um, I can't imagine doing that trip with only 2 people.
That was my impression just looking from the photo, and the impression I got was, and in my notes here, it was like, this looks like a super skilled team. You were scouting from the boats, you were scouting from the shore, like you're doing a bunch of scouting, you're setting safety, and it again, just like visually from one photo, I was like, this seems like this perfect match between skill set and risks until the water level came up. It
And
was
even just logistically, Luke, like I love a 4-person crew just because like you fit, especially for pack rafters or even kayakers, like you fit in a 4-door sedan with gear really well. You can pair off 2 and 2 for running a section or setting shuttle. Fits down to 2 tents if you need to. We had 3 tents on this trip, but like just that number 4 for me is like kind of like a perfect number. Like I've done trips with more and with less, and they've been great. But if someone's kind of looking for like a solid number, that's usually a good place to start.
With what happened in Complicado, you know, two people being lower down and one swimmer and the second person giving chase. Like, it was really nice to not then be alone at the top of the rapid, because that would have been very intimidating, not being able to see what was going on further down, not knowing if my friends were okay, and having a second person to talk through what should we do right now in this moment.
What I say in class is I like having somebody there to grab my paddle, to grab my boat, and grab me. Those are the three people.
Yeah.
So let's get to your crux. And I guess even before that, you, in your notes, when you mentioned that you guys, a few of you had GI illnesses like pretty early on, was that like day 2 or day
I think
3?
it hit,
Yeah,
yeah.
morning of day 3 was when it started hitting for me, and wasn't that bad until the night of day 4. And like, I'm not like, I can't speak for Sarah. For me, it was like mentally and like physically, like actually felt okay. Like I wasn't like feverish or like, or like too fatigued in that way. It was more just like physically hard to maintain hydration and nutrition.
I do think it
Go
hit
ahead.
me a little harder than Jack was just describing, because I felt absolutely miserable the third day, and luckily that wasn't, we had a couple portages and maybe a class 4 to go through, but I just felt like I did not have any extra energy and was just having a hard time kind of enjoying the trip at that point. And if Heidi hadn't brought the Traveler's Diarrheal antibiotic, having to navigate what we did on day 6 would have made things so much worse for, I think, for the group, but for me personally
Same.
specifically.
And this is one of those points that I want to validate. Your team came into this with like awesome preparation and the skill set, and for Heidi last minute pickup to have this and be able to contribute that, and like Rod to have the local. It's like you had the all-star team there, and then you still got spanked. And reading, as soon as I saw the GI illness, I said, okay, let me start my Swiss cheese list. Are you all familiar with that Swiss cheese
Yeah.
model?
It's kind of like death by 1,000 cuts.
I'll give it to Heidi because I love it. The full thing is called, it's James Reason's Swiss cheese model of accident causation. But basically it's just, for me, it's a mental image of a bunch of slices of Swiss cheese. Each slice is a barrier, is protection from harm. And so one of those could be the equipment you're wearing, a dry suit, a helmet. One of those could be going out when the water's not too high. One of those could be, basically you have all these things that can protect you from injury or harm. And what happens is that if the holes just happen to align perfectly wrong, then you're gonna have that exposure to hazard, which you all did. So, okay, so let's get to the high water. Things start. This is in Jack's photos. It was like the one sunny picture, and then the next one's like super foggy, like maybe there's some moisture on the lens, and then the next one's like a night scene, and it's like, oh boy. So it starts pouring rain.
Yeah, I think
Was it
it was the
day 3 or day
afternoon of
4?
day 3,
I think
because
it might have
then
been.
we kept saying, oh, we've had 36 hours of continuous
Yes.
rainfall.
And not just like a little bit of
Yes.
rain, but hard rain.
Yeah, and this is where I give your crew like full benefit of the doubt. I mean, you've got Rod there, you've got a local, like he knows how the area responds to rain. He's seen the forecast, so it's like, yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that you were completely caught off guard despite having a skilled approach to it.
I might set the scene for where we were in that moment. So we pulled over at the end of, I think it's been raining for 36 hours. It's still raining. We're getting a little bit cold, not horrible, but chilly, and are trying to find a spot to camp that would be high enough up if the water continued to rise. And it was tricky to find a spot that seemed okay. And the spot that we found, we kind of created some tent platforms in the jungle brush higher up, and it was the best that we could find, but it would have been honestly terrifying to walk into the jungle right there if the water had continued to rise, because it was so thick and we had seen a big snake, and it was like we did not want to walk into that jungle, and it was super steep. So
Yeah.
I don't think we would have been able to get out right there. But it was looking like flood stage, like plants that were normally on the shore were underwater, and we wake up that morning, and I had done a lot of research about the spot that was coming up. And so I woke up just like pretty terrified of continuing downstream, and was like, I don't know if we should go. I think maybe we should stay here and we can talk through what led us to keep going, which I ultimately felt good about at the time. But felt dramatic. Like we're in this canyon, there's no way to get out. It's still raining. It looks like it's flooding. And maybe I'll let Sarah take over to talk about the in-reach messages.
Let me, even before we go there, what was the dynamic? Because it's kind of on blind dates, learning about each other for the first time. How is the dynamic having that tough That's a tough conversation. Like, do we go? And I know
Yeah,
you were feeling the pressure of the flight schedule. I loved how you put that, Sarah, in your notes. Like, we had our let's get through this so we can make our flights home tomorrow goggles on. It's like, yep, I can see that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice visual. So how was
yeah.
that group dynamic? That's tough. Jack?
I remember that night, it was kind of like raining as we got to camp. It kind of kept raining. It maybe barely stopped. And we kind of just receded into our tents to, make dinner and stuff like that and kind of go to bed early. And it was morale wasn't low, but it was pretty quiet. We're on this beach. The water had probably risen 3 feet in height, and maybe 8 feet or so across the bank. That's what was so dramatic, was kind of how much it came up the slope, because that's where our boats were and our gear were, because there was such limited space above that. So we were able to kind of collect stuff up and reposition, which was great. But it kind of had that like sobering effect of like, okay, water's not dropping, it's rising, things are feeling a lot more serious. And so a lot of us went to bed that night with those feelings. I had like lower morale in terms of like my physical well-being and kind of the sense of like, maybe we're not going to get out tomorrow. I think for me, that kind of led into the next morning, where we kind of had the thought of like, if we're going to go, we need to kind of go soon. I think we were all not really enjoying feeling that pressure. So that's when we kind of all came together and we were like, hey, let's take this one piece at a time and kind of go slow. And I thought we had a good group dynamic in that, and was kind of led with a cautious voice. And I'm glad that we had that, and no one was like, no, we need to get out today or nothing else. Like, we were all kind of open to that open mentality. Else thoughts too.
I think the group dynamic was amazing for how kind of complex and uncertain the situation was in that moment. Everybody stayed pretty calm and collected and communicated well, and it was like comfortable for me to say, oh, I'm feeling really scared. I felt like validated and listened to, while also talking through like, okay, here's what we can do to proceed with caution. I felt like there's no one else I would have rather been with in that situation than the group that we had. Like, I felt really good about the dynamic at that point.
Can you, I mean, this is possibly the greatest lesson to pull out of this, right? The communication part, group dynamics, decision making. Can you come up with some concrete, like some either examples or advice, or like how things were worded, or body language? What can you give another group that maybe doesn't know each other as well?
For me, it's like about being honest. You have to be honest with yourself and honest with your group. Don't let egos get in the way of anything, or feel like you have to commit because someone else is interested in doing something. Everyone felt at ease to say, if one person says no or not comfortable, we're all gonna not push forward to force something to happen, to push people out of their comfort zone. So I think at that second to last camp, we were seeing the water rise. We were evaluating. People were on alert, and I think we were communicating constantly throughout that experience to to make a sound decision the next day. And where you all got together, we discussed it, and we decided to. We had two options. We could either try to paddle upriver to try to get to another takeout, which would have been really hard at that level, or hope that someone was down below at the Arco, which we were between those two locations, to take out there. It turns out there was no one at the Arco, and I don't think we would have been able to paddle up the river at that level.
Mm-hmm.
I think we did a really good job of narrowing down choices efficiently, like not in a rushed way, but I feel like looking back, it was a lot of like, okay, we're not in a sense of urgency here, but can we at least reduce our options down to as few as possible, just for sake of being realistic. 'Cause I think like early on in my mind, I was like, oh, we have all these options of things maybe we could do. We could bushwhack through the jungle, or we could hike out, or we could wait out more days. And we kind of did I thought, a good job of like narrowing those down pretty efficiently to where we kind of had like go or no go decisions or waited out decisions kind of based around what we were all comfortable with. And I just remember like what's interesting about this trip is like there wasn't necessarily, in my opinion and recollection, like one de facto leader. I kind of maybe put that in Sarah's camp a bit because she kind of pulled this together for the most part. And I also kind of think about, Rod's local knowledge a bit. But I remember there just being like a lot of like I feel statements, like I feel this, I feel that, in terms of like versus like I think we should do this or that. And those kind of distilled down to some logical conclusions. So I think being efficient with decision making, but being unrushed about the final decision made and talking openly were
Yeah, and
my key takeaways.
I'm going to
I
reemphasize
was thinking,
those are some really good ones. Let me just reemphasize them. That list of possibilities approach, like that's awesome, super rational. But like, here are the 6 things that we can choose from. Let's break them all down. Doing it in an unrushed way. That's, I think, awesome. And I think that would be hard with what you've described. Like, one of the notes was like, we're worried about the water coming up even more. It's like, if we should we go now? Like, that would be tough for me. And then the I feel statements, you made it very much like, I'm feeling this way. That sounds really effective too. Okay. And I know you both, Sarah and Heidi, you both had
I was
something
just
more.
gonna add to that. I think what we did well, and I know I'm personally very cognizant of this, is when someone's being quiet, it's not because they don't have an opinion, it's just because maybe they don't share the same opinion that the other people who just vocalized what their opinion is. And so I think we did a good job too of saying, like, okay, Heidi, you haven't said anything in a while. Like, are you on board with what we just talked about, or how are you feeling? So I think we were checking in with each other throughout that decision making process to make sure it didn't feel like the majority had spoken and now I can't speak up. And I think, like Jack said, while we did do a good job of talking through the options and not trying to rush, I think we did get to a certain point where we were like, okay, we stay here for a whole nother day, or we go down a little bit and check. And I think there was a point where we are like, all right, well, we do have to make a decision now. So let's make that decision. But it was after a pretty lengthy discussion.
it is a interesting thing to try to put into words what went well and how that dynamic worked well, because it's special when it works that well. But I think a key point that felt important to me was not rushing. And like Sarah said, it did, it hit a point where we had to make a choice, but it never felt like we got to decide right now. It's urgent. Like, let's go. It was like, everyone take a deep breath. We had a couple times where we came together and then people went and made breakfast, or like we took a little break and then came back as a group, and that gave people a chance to really connect with what was going on in their minds and bodies and what they were thinking. And I feel like that was, I don't know, that was an important piece of it.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, listening to how you have described this, I had like a little bit of an emotional response, which is funny because my wife would tell you that I'm not a very emotional person, but it's like, you did this so well. And this is like, it's the golden kernel. It's what I'm trying to figure out when I teach. We teach this in the avalanche courses, and it's pulling it into Swiftwater. Like in the, I'm not going to go into the, I am going to do it. Like, there was a study in the avalanche world where one study, so it's only one data point, but like 83% of these avalanche incidents where they said the signs were there, and it was just like decision making. Like, it wasn't snowpack, it was the group dynamics. And so that's why the avalanche industry is putting so much effort into decision making as part of, like, you go there to learn about the snowpack and they're like, we're going to talk about feelings. We're going to talk about like how to have an open conversation. And you, man, you just killed it. You did such a good job. And I'm kind of scared to think of what would have happened to a group that wasn't able to communicate so well. Because even with that, what happened to you all is super scary, from me on the outside. So yeah, that's what's running through my head. But let's roll forward on the clock. You go down. Well, you had some beta, and if I remember correctly, it was that the next rapid should be portageable even at high water, and the one after that might even be easier because the sieve will be flushed out.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that Sarah can relay her memory of the communications with Rocky. But before that, I just want to mention. So, in addition to looking at the forecast and doing the basic level of reconnaissance, we copied and printed the guidebook pages from Rocky Contis and Greg Schwanginger. I can't remember his last name off the top of my head, but they produced a guidebook for Chiapas and Guatemala for whitewater paddling, and we photocopied the pages for Rio La Venta, which include a map, include a kilometer by kilometer description and a lot of information about rapids. We brought those in print. Then we also had the Gaia GPS cached data on our smartphones. But this is, I think, when Sarah or whoever reached out to Rocky to ask more of like a
Yeah,
site
I think we
specific
just,
question.
when we'd woken up and the water level was a lot higher than we went to bed, we were like, well, can we get any more information right now? And we were like, well, we could try emailing Rocky. Chances are he's not even in service right now. He's probably out on a guided trip. But we're like, yeah, let's try anyway. And it took a while to find the email. And I think I had to send some in-reach messages to my partner back home, asking for Rocky's email and also saying, by the way, if you can find anything about Complicado at high water, please let us know, which completely freaked him out. But we got a very quick response from Rocky, which was awesome and also surprising. And I think, for myself personally, might have put a little too much stock into his reply. He even said, he's like, I don't know your all experiences level. I don't know what exactly the conditions are that you're looking at, but this is my best guess. And I think that partially drove some of our decision making. And looking back on it, it's like, well, it wasn't actually all that helpful because Rocky did not know who we were, what our experience level was.
My impression reading it was that there's no right or wrong. Like this wasn't a true false, and I was like, yeah, you got beta. That's so valuable. The beta wasn't, in some ways it was harmful, but it's like how, he was coming from his best intentions. You're coming from your best intentions. Like there's nothing you can do about it. And it's just another of these like big rain in the dry part of the year during a dry spell. It's like, damn.
The moment that illustrates, kind of back to the conversation around communication, that illustrates it best to me was that, yes, this is like morning of day 5. We're approaching the portage, kind of still with the open mind that we might sit that day out and rest it out and wait for the waters to drop at that beach. Because we passed by that beach below our one we camped at. There was space to camp. The water rose a lot more, maybe not, but it was there. At normal water level, you can kind of eddy out on the right. You can kind of walk in moving water a little bit very simply, and then kind of climb out on rocks and proceed through this kind of boulder jumble. At our flows, there was like high volume moving water flowing into the place where you usually would step out of your boat. It was basically just like you'd be eddying out into a sieve. And so we wanted to kind of scout it because we had perceptions in mind, but not a whole lot of knowledge. And so it kind of lowered someone down to eddy out, climb out on a rock, and kind of scout the entry to the portage. That's when I started to feel uncomfortable with the idea of proceeding. But I also got the sense that Heidi and Sarah, who were kind of managing that situation from above, kind of trusted my insight to kind of report back on what I thought. And like in other trips I've been on, like I've definitely been in times where like the group wants to proceed and I don't, or vice versa. And there's that pressure. And this was just like, they're like, whatever you decide, we're up for it. You can see this, we trust you. And I kind of made the call to turn back. And I felt bad about that because it added a day, but I think it was the right decision. And I was glad to have that level of communication.
It was great.
At that
And
time.
we immediately turned back after you made the call. That's a great decision.
Yeah.
I want to add a few things. One, I'm going to add a couple slices to our Swiss cheese model. So we already have the GI, like just some mental, some physical fatigue. We're adding the time constraint with ideally making that flight schedule and getting back to work and all that stuff, working families. And then we haven't mentioned that you'd lost a paddle at this point
was the next
and
day.
had a spare paddle. Oh, that hadn't happened yet?
No. Next day.
All right.
Yeah, it happened kind of in a similar situation, but as we were making the go decision.
Okay, so we're coming up to that, and then I do want to emphasize one other thing. in that comment in your written note, Sarah, where this was not the case for us, and it should have been a sign of things to come. And it's redundant for you all because you're like, yeah, the water's high. We know things are not meeting our expectations. But just as a learning lessons for other people, I'm paying a lot of attention to this concept of mapping out our expectations ahead of time and then monitoring when the reality doesn't match the expectations, or in other words, looking for change. And it's not my idea. I'm mostly pulling it from Will Gadd, but I've been playing with it, and it's been quite effective so far. To, as soon as you recognize, like, oh, this doesn't match the expectation, doesn't match what the guidebook said, or doesn't match what I thought it was going to be, and it could be river levels or snow surface or energy level or group dynamic, any of that. I'm trying to get better myself at like taking that pause point and then having the, you know, having a conversation with the group or with myself or whatever, and be like, oops, hold on, let's just acknowledge this. Things aren't, what we expected, and then moving forward. So again, redundant for where you were at on that trip, but I wanted to share it as another strategy in this space. Okay, so bring me up to losing a paddle and then having your first
Yeah,
big
I think
swim.
so. We can kind of fast forward over the rest day because after we made that call, we were able to paddle back upstream, and I think that's why we said, all right, let's go look. We know we can get back to this camp if it's not an option, and so we waited it out. I think the next morning the water level had dropped what felt significantly at camp, and in my mind I was like, okay, great, like this means that we're going to have Darumbe Portage and Complicado should be more straightforward for us today. But getting back to the Portage, I think it still wasn't, a slam dunk, like getting to it, the way that it should have been easily accessible, or it is easily accessible other times of year at other water levels. We got to it and we're like, oh, there's still sieves surrounding the access to the portage. And it definitely took us a lot longer to get through shuffling boats and just making sure like people were getting to the next spot okay. And we used ropes several times to make sure we were getting ourselves and our equipment through. And that's when I lost my paddle. I was readjusting my boat on the rock that I was on, and the paddle just slowly started to slide away. And of course, my body's instinct was like, lunge for it. And then, like, well, if I do that, I'm going into that sieve with the paddle. And it disappeared within 5 seconds. And I was like, wow, I cannot believe how stupid that was. I should have attached my paddle to my boat for the portage and la la la. And, was giving myself a hard time. But thankfully, we had brought that spare paddle.
Yeah, the start of the portage was still kind of a stressful space. Like I felt very much in control when we did it, but it was very much like a one person,
Mm-hmm.
one step working through, and it just went slower. It felt well in control, but it still had my nerves kind of high until we were kind of midway through the portage on high ground and kind of working through, weird rock moves and some high, high, not elevation, but like tall, rock reaches and things like that. But being out of the moving
Mm-hmm.
water
And
felt
I
good.
think just Darumbe, to give some context, is a class 6 rapid, and I'm sure at all water levels it's pretty intimidating looking, but when we were there, it was like it sounded like being on the edge of Niagara Falls, and I think that just kind of added to my apprehension a little bit. It was like, all right, well, we can't see the rapid right now because there's all these house-sized boulders blocking our view that we're portaging on the other side of, but it was just, that was kind of the backdrop of what we were working with.
So you get through that, and you try to get a view of Complicado, and you don't have a clear view, and that's the crux, right? You know ahead of time. It's like, is it one that's just basically
Correct.
not portageable?
Correct. Yeah. The wall. So yeah. So halfway through the kind of like midway through the portage, you kind of get to this top of this rock boulder rise where you're able to kind of look downstream and see the rapid Complicado, which is the next rapid and a must run. And you can't see it well. The scale is really tough. I remember getting to that scout and being like, that looks high volume. That looks steep. That looks kind of scary. And like I think like it wasn't like unrunnable or it wasn't like we need to turn back. It just I remember having a kind of pit in my stomach at that point of like, okay, like this is what we're up against. This is realistic, but
And
kind of scary though.
We knew where the sieve was, and it was like it was washed out, so that was a good sign. But it just looked extremely difficult to get down, at any point into eddy to it was unportageable at that point, so we had to come up with a plan to navigate and try to eddy hop down, and that's what we chose to do at that point.
Yeah, and that's typically the move is to like very slowly pick your way down through low volume waters into pretty big apparent eddies. And then at the very bottom where the sieve is, you eddy out on the left and you kind of like walk over and portage the rock. And like at our level, it wasn't one continuous flow. There were still eddies kind of, but it was really hard to perceive how stable those eddies were, if they were draining, if they were boily, if they were going to be in a position that you wanted to be in versus staying in the flow. And there just like wasn't like necessarily a logical line that jumped out at us, aside from kind of the places really maybe were not to be based off of
And I think in my
hydraulics or rocks or
report,
things like that.
the final version, what I wrote was it was hydraulic hopping. It like they were those are eddies at lower water level, but I wouldn't necessarily even call them eddies with what we saw. I mean, it was like you're fighting to stay behind the rock and not get swept out into the main current while you're trying to get your skirt on, and while you're waiting for everyone to say they're ready. And it was definitely a constant, like, okay, make sure we're staying in here to not get swept out before we're ready to go.
So we get ourselves into a place where we're comfortable proceeding from. We're all in the water together, all in our boats. And I think a lot of us were having like trouble getting our skirts on and like holding on to something. It was
Chaotic.
very just like kind of a stressful spot. It's loud, the rapids right behind you, they're all super tight. Chaotic. That's a great way to describe it. And so
It was
yeah,
like teamwork to get skirts on. Like I held Sarah, well, and she held me. Like it was like, yeah.
so we were in the eddy, and at this point, like the plan was to boat scout and hop our way down. We kind of had a general plan of kind of where to avoid and whatnot, and I was able to. I went first and kind of was able to look around the first horizon line and note that that wasn't a good place to be based off the rocks below, and chose to kind of go around into the side of that into a smaller eddy below instead, and did that. We kind of talked amongst ourselves, like, cool, here we go, and we went. And this is kind of like, this is where my heart rate starts to elevate. So I'll probably tag out here and there. But in my recollection, I come around that first eddy or from that first current into the eddy below. And like I hold a paddle up, kind of symbolizing that I'm here, I'm stable. This is a good place to be via the line I just went. And so Rod goes next, and I see him peel out from the top, but I don't see him for a while. And I get nervous because of that. And all of a sudden, he is now out of his boat, passing by where I am. And that's when my heart rate really accelerates and things get stressful, because just what's below us at that point, character of Riverwide, there's not one particular element that's like deathly or scary, but my mind goes to flush drowning concerns and to just high water submersion concerns and things like that. It was not a reasonable place to hop back into it very quickly. So at that point, I blow my whistle and lay chase. And in my mind, the whole time, I was thinking, okay, like, I need to help out Rod. I need to kind of make sure he's okay, keep him in sight, try to help him back into his boat if I can, or at least keep him nearby. But I also need to keep an eye out for myself. And kind of where I landed in this quick decision was like, keep him in your sight. Like, you're not going to help him necessarily by touching him in this moment, like getting to him and laying hands on him. But if you can keep in your sight, that'll be, kind of the best thing you can do in this moment until things settle out, just to keep track of where he is. And did that for the most part, went down maybe 3 or 4 more smaller rapids, or not smaller rapids, rapids within this rapid, staying upright until the last one. And I flipped in the last rapid, kind of entering to the bottom, and swam and was able to kind of get back in kind of like at the bottom. And I could see Rod down below further, kind of in the kind of like slack water of the run out at this point. And he looks fatigued, but he is, he's responding to, to the slap on the head kind of thing, that he's okay. And he gets back in, and things at that point are stressful but stable. We're both back on our boats at that point at the bottom. And I'm looking back up just like, holy shit, like, like what's going to happen to our friends here above us? We're separated and the river's kind of scary. And that's when I kind of settled back down a bit, but also was very nervous and stressed out a bit. So,
Meanwhile, Sarah and I can't see anything.
Yeah.
So we're still at the top. And when Jack started off, we saw him for a short stretch, but we were kind of river right, and to get to that first eddy, he had to go, it was kind of like a big V, like cross the river to the left and then cross back to the right, and there were boulders in the way, so we couldn't see much, and so we didn't see Rod swim, but we heard Jack's whistle and assumed that that's what was happening.
All of a sudden, like I feel really unstable, and I just I'm in the middle of these hydraulics, like it's really boily, really aerated water. I just didn't get any balance. I almost flipped once. I recovered. Then all of a sudden, it just takes me again. And as I was fighting, it just took me again. And then that's when I lost my balance, got in the water, and held on to I was able to hold on to my pack rafts, and I had my paddle for a little bit. And then I reached where Jack is, and we were so close. But at that point, I had one decision to make. I could either try to grab on, and I didn't think that was the best move because I thought it would have put him in danger as well, and let go of my boat. And I decided to hold on to my boat because it was taking me, and I already tried to self rescue once, but I couldn't flip my boat upright. I was focused on more just being mindful of where I was, trying to breathe because I was getting submerged under the water uh, very frequently, and I barely had like 1 second to reemerge and take my breath, going through that whole set of rapids, which felt like an eternity. And so I was fairly exhausted, but I think what made the difference was I was able to hold on to my boat very tightly. I was able to focus on that, relax, and then I did know that when I was out, I did feel the long channel of slack water. Like Jack said, I was very exhausted. I remember all of a sudden seeing my paddle pop up right next to me. I was all happy. I grabbed it immediately. Then my boat kind of went away from me as I grabbed my paddle. So I had to chase my boat again. And that really tired me out. But I finally got in. And even my first self rescue, I was just like kind of like just hunched over and just toppled back in. And it took me a full like 2 minutes to retry the self rescue. I got really big hit to my hip and one to my knee, but I felt it was fine. Nothing was broken, but I did see a big bruise later, like and then that's where I reconnected with Jack. I gave him the all good sign that that was all right, and then we positioned ourselves to be as supportive as possible for Heidi and Sarah to now run that rapid.
I think one thing that stuck out in my mind with Rod's experience, and I guess I'm jumping ahead a little bit over what Heidi and I went through, but I think when we met up with them down below, you know, Rod at first it seemed was like shaking it off a little bit, like, oh, like, yeah, that was scary, but I'm all good. And I think to just go back to the like communication and like having a supportive group, I remember Jack kind of turned to him and said like that was scary, and like I was scared, and that could have been bad. And just from an outside perspective, I think it showed Rod like it's okay to be scared, and it's okay to like not want to shake that off, and like just show some validation that like that wasn't anything to do with like you or your skill level, like you just had a really scary experience, and like don't just jump past that, like feel it.
I understand that it was very quite serious, my swim. I don't. I understand, but I think I did what I could best do to put myself in the best position to survive and come out on top. So I feel like I came out well. So I appreciate that, and I felt a lot of gratitude just to be out and able to get back in my boat and acknowledge that all my limbs, extremities were intact.
So let's jump back up, Heidi. You guys hear the whistle, and then I was impressed from Sarah's notes. Like you made a plan, and you discussed like how the two of you were going to get down, not knowing what's downstream.
All we have is the whistle. We can't see anything, and our I think both in our heads are imagining a worst case scenario or like what we could be encountering downstream. But we're not talking about that. We were just like, okay, our only option right now is to figure out how we get down safely together as best as we can. And so we decided to follow Jack's line to that next spot and stay close together, and kind of looked at each other like, who's going to go first? And Sarah was like, I'll do it. And I was so grateful in that moment. But yeah, I followed Sarah. It was a tricky move and big hydraulics, but we made it through that part and then got to what we thought was this eddy spot, and it just like wasn't really an eddy. There wasn't room for two of us. We still couldn't see anything. Like it didn't feel like you could really boat scout because of the way that the rocks were positioned, and Sarah was a little in front and was like able to hop out onto this rock, and it was at that point when she got eyes on Jack and Rod and was like, I see them, they're good. And so we, I think, both had pretty massive sighs of relief at that point, being like, okay, like we don't know what happened, but they're at the bottom, they're okay. I think even though we couldn't see what was coming, that gave us some confidence that whatever happens, we're gonna get down there. Sarah, do you want to add to
Yeah,
this part?
I think that point of hopping out on the rock, I think, is something I look back on and like, was that like the smartest thing? Because it was not easy to get back into my boat, and I wasn't sure that I was gonna get back in and not flip, and I wasn't sure that I was gonna get back in and be able to get my skirt on. But I think to the point Heidi made, that psychological relief that we felt seeing both Jack and Rod okay at the bottom of the rapid was such a huge factor for me feeling like I could then proceed in the rapid. I think we were both just thinking worst case scenario, we don't know what's going on. So it was definitely a little bit of a risk I think I took jumping out onto that rock, but the benefits outweighed the negatives. And then it also allowed me to get eyes on the rest of the rapid. And it's hard trying to think back on this, what the exact distance was, but I recall there being like at least a football field between where we were and where Jack and Rod were at the bottom of the rapid. And looking at it, and I was like, oh my God, like this is the part that we could not see from the portage. And it's like, this is huge. Like, this is massive water. And I was looking at it and I was trying to talk to Heidi. She's like, I can't hear you. And I'm just focusing on like trying to stay in this hydraulic right now, Eddie. And I was like, okay. Like, I was trying to tell her what I thought the move was. Like, sieve was gone, it's filled in, but it's like, well, someone swims. Like, could we still potentially get stuck in that sieve if we swim right over it? Maybe, And then it's like, there just didn't seem
Yeah.
like a great straightforward way. And I was like, I think we just get in and we try and shoot down the middle. And it was, yeah, one of the scarier river scenarios that I've had, and probably the biggest rapid that I've paddled. And yeah, we managed to get through it upright. I got totally spun, but at that point we were just through the rapid and we were looking back at it like, that was messed up. Like, if we'd known that that's what we were facing, we were all like, yeah, we would not have decided to go through with that. And we were all just, I think at that point, like, adrenaline was pumping, but we were also just so relieved to be back together, reunited, and, just talking through that very quickly, because then we still had a couple more like class 3 at least rapids to get through, plus a 15-kilometer flat water paddle to finish out that day. And it was probably already 1 p.m. at that point.
So where I want to go from here, we just have one more little like chapter of your trip, and then I'd like to get sort of a summary of what we did well, what could we do better, just sort of like the classic debrief in terms of learning lessons. So as far as what happens next, I love this line in your write-up, Sarah. It's like, at this point, we were pretty fatigued and started making some mistakes.
Yeah.
It's like you just ran blind to this class 5 high water, and it's like, so we lost another paddle, we swam some class 3 rapids. You're just pumped.
Yeah. It kind of felt
right?
like we were rushing because A, there's nowhere to camp in that section. B, we like this was our buffer day, and we were like, all right, well, we got through the hard part. Like, let's get out of here now and let's go get our boat and get back to town. If we hadn't gone through what we just gone through, we would have, yeah, made some slightly different decisions and not felt as rushed as I think I felt we were in that last section.
And I assume part of it is that like you're over the crux, right? Like you just survived something that was borderline survivable, and you're probably all a little bit psychologically messed up from what a close
Mm-hmm.
call that was.
I think we were
Yeah.
tired. We were really tired. 'Cause we had gotten up super early that morning, like at when it was still dark out, I think. And I just wanted to say one other thing about I followed Sarah down that huge bottom piece of the rapid, and she picked a badass line. However much control she was in, she nailed it. And I was like kind of shocked that we made it through both upright but got to the bottom. And I think our first questions were like, are you guys okay? And then once we got the yes on that, I was like, Jack, was that a class 5 rapid? And he was like, yes. It's like, oh my goodness. And so also definitely the biggest rapid that I've paddled. I'm not a class 5 boater. And so from there, yeah, we were mentally and physically exhausted and still had a long way to go. And I think that those high water class 3s would have been super fun if we had been starting the morning with them. But because of where we were at, we were rushing, I think.
Absolutely. And at like maybe the second rapid in, Rod looked at us and just said, I'm portaging. And I was like, that was a very smart decision.
At that point, I felt I was pretty self-aware, and I was just done for the day. I just wasn't even gonna try any complicated moves, or even if it looked fun. So I ended up portaging like several rapids.
And I think Heidi, Jack, and I went to look at a line, and this is where Jack had a second close call. You know, it wasn't a strainer per se, but we didn't fully realize exactly how much current was pushing into a boulder that had a tree sticking out that there was the potential to get caught on. And Jack flipped and thankfully went under the tree and didn't get caught. And Heidi and I were kind of like we can't really help. Like we're still up, ready to put on and go after him.
This is a good transition to how I want to wrap things up, which is with these debrief prompts. And one of the prompts is, when were we most at risk? And so I thought about this after reading your report. And at first I thought like, oh, complicado, like period, end of story. But then I started wondering if it wasn't the section after complicado, when you are exhausted and I didn't know, Rod, about like taking the initiative to portage stuff, but I'm really curious, like, you know, statistically or whatever, like you made it past the hardest part, but then you're in a place where you're so depleted that things that technically had less hazard might have been more dangerous for you.
Looking back, there weren't desirable camp spots, but there were spots that you could have made work. And if we did not have flights at 6 a.m. the next morning, I think we might have considered stopping because we knew we were tired and we had some more food. We had backup food. It was really the pressure of the flights and already being a day behind. And so that's one of my biggest takeaways is, yeah, we encountered really high water and that created a risk, but we also created risk for ourselves by not allowing a bit more of a buffer.
That's one of my biggest takeaways is, especially on an international trip where you are flying in and out and you do have these logistical constraints, I think building in a lot more buffer time is something that I'm going to definitely consider moving forward. I think we were like, oh, one day, you know, that should be plenty.
In these last minutes, let's try to kind of formalize our lists here. So, what did you do well? And I can fill in any gaps. I have my list of what you did well, but What did you do well?
Communicate, I think, is one of the big ones. Good communication.
Big time, yeah. I'll fill it in. I don't need to, like, I've already got them written down. The planning, like you had done a bunch of rivers research, weather forecast, logistics, you pull in the local, right? So awesome. The scouting, you did a bunch of scouting from shore, from boat, you set up safety. You did some like technical portaging using ropes, like to support each other. Like this is a serious skill set. You had a spare paddle that you needed, like you had the equipment, you had meds. So that's what I had on the list. And then the group dynamic and the communication getting like the gold star, that was major. Any that you'd add to that?
I think that covered it pretty well.
Okay. And then as far as what you could do better, adding in more time. What else?
I think trust what you're seeing. When we looked down from the portage, like Jack said, it looked pretty gnarly and scary. And again, it would have been a really awkward place to stay, but we could have stayed there. I think if, yeah, yeah, it just was a close call, like knowing what I know with how scary that swim was and how scary the paddle was. I would have waited that out and said whatever about the flights. Like maybe we can't get an inReach message out to ask someone to change it, which was part of the calculation because it was too narrow. Canyon was too narrow right there, but it just at some point that doesn't matter. Like what matters is getting home safe. And so I think we were like, well, the sieve is probably filled in, like kind of justifying all of these things because we wanted to get out of there. But I think we all had some alarm bells going off at that point. And so trusting when that happens.
Which is so hard to do. And I would love to capture. Maybe you'll think of it at some later point and you can share it with me. But it's like we have this confirmation bias. Like we see the data that supports what we already think we should do. And it's so hard. And that's part of why I'm trying to, for myself, like really be explicit about here's what I expect, and then physically learning to get better at acknowledging when things don't match my expectations, and then pausing. I don't know. There's got to be somebody's figured this out.
I mean, maybe it's that's something that you build into your trip planning. It's like what are some signs that we should look out for as we're doing this expedition that should send off alarm bells, but recognizing we might be blind to them in the future for X, Y, or Z reason. Like setting some intentional planning aside to think about that before you even go.
I love that.
Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for this extended chat.
Well, thank you. It was great to talk about it and to see everyone, and a lot was learned on this trip, and a lot can be valuable to others, not just for this river, but for any river, to be able to mitigate risk and make better decisions and learn about communicating with team, which is essential.
Well said.
Yeah, well said. I'm going to close her down. Thanks. Yeah, thanks again. This was great. I learned a lot from you all. Thanks for sharing your hard experience. That's tough.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you.